How's it going, everybody? Today we are finally talking about my top 10 albums of the year. This has been a really tough list to make, I'm going to be honest with you guys. There's been a lot of changes that I made over the past couple weeks because I just can't really decide on what albums I want to put in this list. Because honestly, I feel like there's way more than 10 albums that could fit in this top 10 list. And there's a lot of albums that were really solid, and I didn't have issues with them. But, you know, kind of looking back, and like some of the criteria that I used to like kind of grade and like place these albums in the top 10 was like my emotional connection I had with the album, plus, you know, like technicality, things like that. Just did it have really good riffs, things like that. There's so many different forms of criteria that I kind of had in mind when I was making this list. And still, I don't know if I feel like it's very conclusive. I feel like there's still some albums that I can move around or maybe move out of it, put another one in there. I'm sure a lot of people are that way. That's why I'm probably going to include some honorable mentions just to give you guys an idea on some albums that I may have put in my top 10, but just didn't really fit in there for one reason or another. But yeah, I'm just really stoked to share this with you guys. And without further ado, let's get right into it. So, to kick things off with my number 10 album of the year, it is Holofront, The Price of Dreaming. Oh my gosh. Okay, first off, if you guys haven't heard of Holofront, they're an absolutely fantastic metalcore band out of Michigan, which happens to be my home state. So they're a local band for me, and I've been listening to them for years now. They're absolutely fantastic. I'm so glad they got signed to Unified because I think they totally deserve it. And I really think it was the right label for them. You know, you got bands like Era. Oh God, I'm trying to think of all the bands that are. You know what? I'm not even going to think about it. Anyway, Unify is a fantastic record label. Two main bands for me to name that are like just huge in the scene. But yeah, Holofront, I mean, catchy choruses. You got awesome lead guitar work going through like this entire album. You got some kind of like electronic influences thrown in every now and then, kind of just like spruce things up. There's some ambience thrown in there. There's parts that almost sound a little bit Thal at times. I wouldn't really say that's like an overarching theme of the band or anything, but there's like a few riffs that was like, oh shit, that kind of goes hard. You know, it gets a little bit more djenty sounding. And then you also have a lot of very important topics that are, you know, spoken about throughout this album. You got tracks like Heritage that's just really heavy and pummeling, and that talks about, well, I mean, if you read the lyrics, you'll have a pretty good idea of what it's talking about. But there's a lot of not so good people out there, people that aren't as tolerant, if that's the way I should put it. So it kind of speaks on that a little bit. I think it's an issue that a lot of people can relate to, especially from the area that I'm from. I know a lot of people that fit that bill very well, and it's not too great. But yeah, getting back into the music side of things, yeah, I think Holofront really killed it with this album, and I just can't wait to hear where they go with the rest of their discography. But yeah, I thought they were very deserving of this top 10, regardless of my bias of them being a local band. I really do think this is a great album, and I think they deserve all the praise that they get. But yeah, that was my number 10. All right, so my number 9 spot goes to an album that has really split their fan base in half. Some people absolutely loved it. Some people thought it was hot garbage. You know what? I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. It was a pretty drastic change in sound, though, and I can understand why people didn't care for it, but it honestly grew on me quite a bit. And that number 9 spot goes to Thornhill Heroine. Yeah, so this album is pretty divisive in the community. There's a lot of people that were pretty upset with the band. They were like taking it really personally. Like, I think I heard there's like death threats involved or something. I don't know if it got that far, but like it was getting pretty bad. People are pretty toxic online about this. But, you know, when they went from the Dark Pool back in like 2019, which in my opinion is their magnum opus, and that remains true, I think it is just an absolute 10 out of 10 album. After they released that and they came out with their first single after that, for Heroine, people are like, what do you do? Why'd you change your sound? I want the dark hill. I want the Dark Pool Part 2. And that's not what they did. They were like, all right, we know this album is super successful. We're gonna tilt it on its head. We're gonna do something completely different. And I respect the shit out of that. I thought it's awesome. I thought it's such a baller move. And they went with this like Deftones meets Muse kind of vibe. It's really cool. It's a really interesting mix. And it's really interesting too because it's a very moody album, and you start reading the lyrics and it kind of reads like a high school drama flick almost. It's really weird. But something about it, just the moodiness, especially when you watch like the music videos along with some of the tracks, it just ties it all together. It makes so much sense. But honestly, if there's a track that I could talk about in this album that I feel like doesn't get enough love, it'd have to be Blue Velvet. I think the way it slows down and opens up that ambience, it has to be one of the most just downright gorgeous songs I've heard this year. I think it's very underrated. I didn't really hear a whole lot of people talking about it, and that's why I wanted to put it in this top 10 list so bad, because I was like, you guys need to know. Because I know a lot of people avoid this album with all the initial thoughts that people had, which is totally understandable. You know what I mean? I don't blame you for that. And to be honest, I was kind of in the boat of not really caring for it at first when I heard the singles, but I think it grew on me quite a bit. And you know what? I'm pretty happy with the number 9 spot. But yeah, that was my number 9 album. All right, so my number 8 spot goes to a band from Sweden. They're a metalcore band who's been mixing ideas like thal and EDM, trap, just to name a few different genres they mix into their sound. And they've been throwing it all together, and somehow they're making it work. I don't know how they do it. I mean, you know what? Maybe they're just built different. Maybe that's how they do it over in Sweden. I don't know. But this band is absolutely killing it lately. And one of the things I found really interesting about this album in particular is that the titles, well, the tracks actually spell out the title of the album. So for those who don't know, my number 8 spot goes to AVIANA, Corporation. So I thought this album was absolutely fantastic. There's so many awesome breakdowns throughout the entire thing. And they literally got the prior vocalist to AVIANA in there, which for those who don't know is Marcus from Vent Animate, which also happens to be one of my favorite bands. And oh my god, I believe it's the track Paradox is the one that he features on. That track goes so hard. And honestly, like, so do all the tracks on the album, if I'm being honest. I mean, I'm a sucker for thal, I'm a sucker for metalcore, and then you throw in all these other elements that you can't really predict, because honestly, I feel like every song on this album is fairly unique from each other. I don't feel like there's a whole lot of overlap between the tracks, at least not too much. I mean, you have choruses that might sound a little similar, but it's the same person, so I mean, you're gonna have a little bit of overlap at least. But yeah, Joel, oh man, his vocals are just top notch. Definitely recommend listening to this album. I think is definitely an album that people didn't talk about a whole lot, is really glossed over, but man, you just gotta listen to it. If there's a track I can recommend off this album, though, just thinking off the top of my head, it would probably have to be, oh man, Anomaly is a really interesting one. I'd say Anomaly, Paradox, Rage. Honestly, you can't really go wrong with any of the tracks on this album, if I'm being honest. That goes for, I think, like all the albums on this top 10 list, if I'm being real. But yeah, that was my number 8 spot. All right, so my number 7 spot goes to an album that's still pretty fresh to me. I haven't been listening to it as long as the rest of these albums, but honestly, it blew me out of the water so much when I first listened to it, and on repeated listens, that it had to make my top 10. I mean, there's simply no way. I actually had to rewrite my top 10 just so I could fit this one in here, because I was like, oh, I just can't leave it out. It wouldn't be doing it justice. It is also created by a YouTuber that I've been watching for years. I absolutely love him. I think he's a fantastic dude. I love watching his content. But for those who don't know, my number 7 spot goes to KARDASHEV, Liminal RITE. Oh my gosh, man. So this band actually, KARDASHEV, I'm pretty sure they created their own subgenre. They call it death gaze. People have mixed shoegaze with, like death metal, black metal elements before. That's not entirely new, but the way they did it is just so unique. So you got, like I said, you got shoegaze, death metal, black metal, prog. You got some parts that almost get a little bit more into like the deathcore side a little bit. Some of the, some of the riffage that they throw in every now and then, not in every track. But it's really interesting just how many ideas they could throw into this album and absolutely get away with it. Like, it doesn't feel like they're just throwing things at a wall and seeing what sticks. It feels like that it's actually fitting in with the narrative of the album. I mean, concept albums are just, ever flowing. I mean, it's going from one track to the next. And this album, it flows. It makes me cry, man. No, seriously though, like on my first reaction, I think I was like this close to crying. I don't know if I actually shed the tear, but I was like welling them up. I was like, like I was struggling. I believe it was the track Apparitions in Candlelight. I thought, oh my gosh, that has to be like one of my favorite tracks of the year overall. I said that too with like Blue Velvet from Thornhill, but this track too is just, absolutely gorgeous. I mean, there's so much going on as far as like different parts of this track, you know what I mean? Really common staple in, you know, progressive metal and all the subgenres. But oh, if you haven't listened to this album, I totally recommend it. It really is like a one of a kind experience. And it's something that no matter how many times and how many ways I explain it to somebody, it doesn't do it justice. There's so much ambience. There's so much just it's so much, but it's beautiful. It's truly one of a kind. I don't really know how else to explain it, if I'm being honest. You just have to go give it a listen. But yeah, that was my number 7. All right, my number 6 spot goes to an album that is definitely an interesting one as far as this list goes, because it's very different from the rest. A lot happier tone overall, which is not something I typically say about anything even remotely metal. This isn't technically a metal album, if we're being really picky, but you know what? It's close enough, and I reacted to it on my channel, so I'm going to count it. And you know what? This is an album of the year list, not a metal album of the year list, so I reserve my right to put in whatever I want. But no, seriously, this album was actually really interesting. It's something that really caught me off guard. I hadn't heard this band until I checked them out on my channel, and they're one of the first bands I checked out. But yeah, with that being said, my number 6 album of the year goes to Dance Gavin Dance, Jackpot Juicer. So this album was really interesting. There's a lot of tracks like Pop Off and oh my god, I'm trying to remember some of the names of the tracks right now. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I'm having some trouble. But you know, there's some more like uplifting, more like upbeat tracks that are going on, a little bit more funky. This album in general is just very funky. It had like a really strong 70s vibe throughout with like the bass lines, some of the guitar licks and stuff. You got like these interesting synth kind of sounds that were going on, like that kind of stuff. Very interesting mix of like post-hardcore, got this like 70s vibe, and then you start getting into some heavier spots once you hit like the second half of the album. It starts to get into a very like dark spot for this band. You start to get some like breakdowns almost a little bit. Well, I don't know about breakdown, but it gets heavier. I'll just put it that way. Very interesting concepts thrown throughout. I love Will Swan's guitar playing. I thought it was awesome. John Mess on, you know, the harsh vocals. I thought he absolutely killed it. And I just thought overall is a really interesting album. It's not something that I thought I would typically listen to. It's a little bit out there, but honestly, I kind of like that out there stuff. You know what I mean? It's just really wacky, and I wasn't expecting it. But I also haven't really listened to a whole lot of Dance Gavin Dance, so who knows? Maybe when I go back and listen to more of their older stuff at some point, I might change my mind on this album. But for now, it's my number 6, and yeah, that's about where I'm gonna keep it. All right, so my number 5 spot goes to an album that really caught me off guard this year. This band's been around for quite a long time in the metalcore scene, but I never actually listened to him before. It was one of those bands that I heard in passing. I was like, oh yeah, that's cool, but you know, I don't know if I'm ever gonna listen to it, that kind of thing. And I finally listened to this album for the first time. This is my first album from this band, and they have quite a bit in their back catalog, so I have some catching up to do. But man, I mean, this just hit me right in the feels. I cried to this album, if I'm being honest. I'm not afraid to admit that. You know what? Grown men cry, and that's fine. That's healthy. I think if you're not crying, you probably should do so, for one thing, because it's very therapeutic in my opinion. I mean, you don't have to cry all the time, obviously. You don't have to be always like, oh man, what the hell? But just let out a therapeutic cry to some good music. I'm telling you, you're gonna feel better. But yeah, my number 5 goes to the Devil Wears Prada, Color Decay. So this album, like I said, it really caught me by surprise. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it. Like well, I guess that's not entirely true. I heard the singles, and I knew the singles were bangers. But I wasn't sure how the rest of the album was going to be, because I was like, oh, I don't know. Can they really, you know, can they top the heaviness of this? And when you go into the album, it's probably best not to really go in expecting it to be a heavy album, at least with just standard heaviness. This is a very emotionally heavy album. I mean, it hits you like a brick, and I wasn't expecting it at all. I think that's part of the reason why I did end up crying, was because I was just like thinking of tracks like Watchtower and Sacrifice that are a lot more just traditionally like metalcore heavy, and then you hit tracks like Cancer, 25, I think like Trapped, things like that, and it's a lot more just like feels like, oh my gosh. I mean, I was crying like a little baby through different parts of it, and I am completely okay with admitting that. Um, the choruses were absolutely fantastic. The choruses really just made it for me. I thought this album was just fantastic. Obviously, you know, it's in my top 10. It's in my top 5. Um, but one of the things I wanted to talk about was how I feel like they had a really good job of mixing like metalcore styles with this like emo vibe. Something that I haven't really heard in quite a while, and it kind of brought me back to listening to some of these older bands that I haven't listened to in years. It kind of brought me back to like that hardcore punk era of music that I'd listened to. You know, I went back and listened to Rise Against, which I guess isn't very like emo, but it has that time period feeling. And then you got like Hawthorne Heights. I listened to Ohio's for Lovers, you know, just because I can. Why not? And then I started to kind of connect the dots on where the Devil Wears Prada maybe got some of their influence from. Which is really interesting because I actually haven't listened to older Prada, so it might be even more evident throughout their discography. I could be wrong. But yeah, I thought this is a really fantastic album. And honestly, like, I just shared so many emotional moments with this album. It's really gotten me through a lot of tough times this year, and I owe them a lot. I owe Devil Wears Prada a lot for this album. But yeah, that was my number 5. All right, so my number 4 spot goes to an album that just hit me in the feels so hard. This band has been going on for many years, just like Devil Wears Prada has, and they absolutely killed it with this album, if I'm being honest. I mean, it hit me in the feels. I was crying like a little baby. The lyrical content was enough for me to just get sad immediately. Especially knowing like what is going on like in the music video. There's a music video that features a cat. If that doesn't give it away, then I'm not sure what will. But my number 4 spot goes to Counterparts, a eulogy for those still here. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Counterparts, the track Whispers of Your Death is about Brendan Murphy's cat that ended up passing away after this album came out. And, you know, Brendan Murphy has been struggling with his own mental health issues. And just knowing about all of that put together and then listening to this album and just, you know, I mean, the orchestration, not the orchestration, but the composition and everything in general was enough for me to cry. But then just the lyrics and all of the weight behind it and just the power in Brendan Murphy's voice, the screams, the clean vocals and everything. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, I was crying like a little baby throughout this album. They really did such a good job. The guitars were fantastic. I thought it just really was a good way of accentuating what Brendan Murphy was saying, because you got the feels from like this more kind of ambient lead going on. Very cool stuff. I thought this album was a really good way of just throwing in all these really sad emotions and just hitting it like a truck at the same time. Like really crunchy riffs, nice breakdowns. Yeah, what else can I say about this album? I mean, it just hits. Like, absolutely. I totally recommend you guys listen to this, especially if you want some, like, sad boy heavy music. I really feel like this album just fulfills that criteria, like, to a T. But yeah, that was my number 4 spot for this list. All right, folks, now we're getting serious. This is down to my top 3 albums of this year. And let me tell you, these 3 were really, really close to my deliberation. Like, I honestly could have put these anywhere in my top 3, and I probably would have been okay with it. But I'm going to keep it the way it is, just for simplicity's sake. My number 3 album on this list goes to a band that only has 2 members. It has 2 members. They got some absolutely insane alien noises going on. Some of the craziest breakdowns I've heard this year. They're just over the top. So cool. My number 3 album on this list goes to Darko US, Oni. So this band is just absolutely like on another echelon right now. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know how they're cranking out music so fast, because they're literally going to be coming out with an EP probably like by the time I release this video, which is absolutely nuts, because that means they have 2 releases this year, plus Tom Barber being in Chelsea Grin. So that's 3. Like, I don't know what they do with all that time. I don't know how they can write music so fast, but they do. Absolutely nuts. But like, huge props to them. I thought this album was probably one of the most unique albums I've heard in a really long time. Breakdowns. The breakdowns were absolutely menacing. You got like tracks like Evolving, which I believe has Shaolin G from Unity TX, I think is the band. Very, very cool. Dragon Chaser. Dragon Chaser was a really sick song. Honestly, every song on this album is awesome. Come Home with Roy Rodriguez. Probably one of the coolest shoegazy tracks I've heard this year. And they're not even like a primarily shoegaze band, which makes it like that much more interesting. Just overall a really neat album. And I don't even know what else to say about it. You just gotta go listen to it. Some of the coolest deathcore I've heard in a really long time. So much going on. 10 out of 10 would recommend. But yeah, that's my number 3 spot on this album of the year list. And without further ado, let's get to our number 2. Okay, we're down to our top 2 albums of this year. My number 2 album goes to a band that absolutely killed it this year. One of my favorite, most complete album experiences I've heard in years. I feel like they're really just reshaping the deathcore scene as we speak. And it's honestly one of the most unique deathcore albums I've heard in a really long time, if ever. I don't know. I mean, I feel like I need to listen to a little bit more deathcore before I can say something like that, because regardless, there's still a lot of bands that I need to check out, and there always will be, because, you know, it's an ever-expanding genre. But this album really just stood out to me like something fierce. I mean, the vocals, the instrumentals, everything. My number 2 spot goes to Enterprise Earth, The Chosen. Dude, if you guys haven't heard this album, you're doing yourself a disservice. This isn't just some run-of-the-mill deathcore album. This is a prog deathcore masterpiece, in my opinion. I mean, it's not something I typically think of, you know, progressive deathcore. That's a little bit counterintuitive in some ways. But honestly, these guys have a really good way of just mixing together like this medieval sounding, it just sounds medieval throughout the entire album. And I guess looking at the album art, it makes sense. You got these like nice clean acoustic guitar parts, really setting the mood, really, you know, kind of lulling you into this gorgeous passage. And then you get hit with these massive breakdowns, and it just gets so pissed off so quick. Dan Watson has such a crazy vocal range. He's doing highs, he's doing lows, he's doing growls, he's doing tunnel throats, he's doing what have you. Any vocal technique you can think of, he's doing it. At least to what I can think of. There might be some that he didn't actually do, and I just named off random shit, but there's so much that he does do. It would be easier to say what he does not do in this album. I'll put it that way. I know not everybody was a huge fan of his vocals. I highly disagree. I thought they're some of the coolest vocals I've heard in a really long time. They're very unique. Just fantastic overall. The instrumentals were awesome. And hey, if you don't like the vocals, they have an instrumental version of the album that's out. So, you know, it's a win-win. You know, there's a little bit for everybody. But overall, I mean, just the innovation in this album alone was enough for me to put it on this list. And there's so many awesome parts in this album that I could probably pick out one amazing riff from every track, and I could still keep going. I could probably add a couple, if I'm being honest. But yeah, that was my number 2. And before we get into my number 1, I'd like to show you guys some of my honorable mentions. Alright, so for my honorable mentions this year, I have a list pulled up because there's no way I can remember all these albums. But I still feel like there's some albums that I missed in here that I didn't put in that I totally could have. But I didn't want my honorable mentions to go on forever, so I had to kind of trim it down a little bit for you guys, just, you know, so make it a little bit easier. But yeah, some of the albums that I really liked this year that just didn't make my list would have to be the Gloom in the Corner, Trinity. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. There was a lot going on. It's very cinematic. It feels like a play. Tala, The Generation of Danger, really cool new deathcore sound. It's very out there. It's, you know, if you like nu metal, you're probably gonna like it. It's just even heavier nu metal. ELEGY with Damnum, very interesting album. That's, you know, progressive. You could say progressive metal, but they really started off as like tech death. And as the years have gone on, they've included a lot more progressive influences, even though the progressiveness was always there. It's definitely taken more precedence in their sound. Cabal, Magno Interictus. Awesome album. I really love it. It's a really cool mix of like deathcore, and you got a little bit more hardcore influence thrown in there. I believe they're from Denmark. Correct me if I'm wrong. Really cool album. There's even some like electronic influence thrown in every now and then. Chelsea Grin, Suffer in Hell. I wasn't sure if I wanted to include this as an EP or a full-length album, because there's going to be a second part to this album coming out in March of next year, I believe. So I wasn't sure really where to hold it, but dude, I absolutely love this. It's I'm trying to remember if it's got to be close to like half hour long, something like that. But Crystal Casket, definitely one of my favorite breakdowns. And when I heard that in the Try Not to Headbang challenge, I was like, yep, this is it. This is what I needed. Absolutely fantastic album. Ocean's Day, Alaska, Disparity. This is really cool. This is a band that I wasn't super familiar with. I'd heard their name for quite a few years, but I hadn't listened to them. A lot of really interesting elements thrown in. There's actually some like trap and like lo-fi stuff going on, and then they just start hitting you with these solid chugs. Some of the coolest riffage I think I've heard this year, actually. Super underrated. It almost made my list, but I feel like it didn't connect with me as much as some of the other albums on my list, so I didn't include it, unfortunately. And now we go on to Spite, Dedication of Flesh. Dude, okay. Spite, Dedication of Flesh. This is an album that, when I first heard it, I was absolutely mind blown. My brain was just melted because of how heavy and unrelenting it was. I still feel that way about the album. I will say, it kind of, I don't know, some of the excitement of it did kind of fall off a little bit for me, but it's still a very solid album, and I think it's good enough that it should make my honorable mentions, because honestly, like, it is just fucking brutal, man. Oh my gosh, it gets me going. It's real, like, gym music, you know what I'm saying? Bad Omens, Death of Peace of Mind. Now, this is actually a new album for me. I just checked this out recently. I didn't include it in my top 10 because I was like, I'm not really sure if I should include it. It's really new, fresh on my mind. But definitely, had I been listening to this for even like another month or so, easily would have made my top 10. Absolutely fantastic album. I love the mix of pop and other elements, and pop and rock and stuff with the metalcore sound. I think it's a really cool, good way for people to find metalcore and, you know, kind of get introduced to this genre. So really cool, like, entry level album for people. Dayseeker, Dark Sun, same way. Really just gorgeous album along with Bad Omens. Rory Rodriguez has one of my favorite voices in metalcore right now, along with Noah Sebastian of Bad Omens. When I heard those two, I was like, absolute bangers. Dayseeker, Dark Sun, it was a really good album. I wish it would have been a little bit heavier, but I know that wasn't the point of the album. It's a very deep and personal album to Rory and the rest of the band, so I understand why they didn't go that direction, and honestly, more power to them. I do think it's a really cool album. Boundaries, Burying Brightness. Now, this was an album that I had messed up when I was trying to record my reaction, and the audio didn't pick up properly. So the only thing I picked up was me talking into my microphone, so there's no music. Unfortunate mistake. But this was a really, really cool album. This is also a case of this album being a little bit too new for me to want to put in my top 10, just because, you know, I need to listen to it a little bit longer. There's a lot of cool mixture of, like, hardcore and just, like, I don't know, you got cleans in there. It's really cool. I don't really know how else to explain it, and I still need to kind of let it soak in a little bit more. I'm not fully familiar with it yet, but super cool album. Totally recommend. And now we have two more that I'd like to include. I'm gonna, you know, try and end this. Shadow of Intent, Elegy. That was a really dope album. I wasn't sure how to feel at first when I heard them going more of a traditional, like, mellow death sound instead of their deathcore roots. I liked it. Maybe not as much as their prior stuff, because, I mean, Melancholy, dude, probably one of my favorite albums I've heard in years. So it's pretty tough to beat that. Kind of like the whole Darkpool situation of Thornhill. Super dope album, though. I really liked it. I love all the orchestral symphonic stuff that's going on. I'm pretty sure they had, who was it? From Flesh God Apocalypse. I don't remember his name. He was the one that actually composed a lot of that symphonic stuff, I'm pretty sure. So that's really cool. And then, last but not least, Fit for an Autopsy, or What the Future Holds. This is also a really cool album. I love all the Gojira influence that they had in this album too. It's very apparent, and it's something that's been apparent in a lot of their prior discography, but I feel like it was very apparent in this album, especially with newer Gojira and stuff. You know, last year they literally released an album, Fortitude. But Fit for an Autopsy did a really good job with this album. There's nothing I would say that's really wrong about it. I didn't listen to it as much later on in the year, and I feel like it kind of fell off for me a little bit in my ratings, so I didn't put it in my top 10. However, super dope album. Highly recommend people check it out. Plus, I love Joe Bad's vocals. Okay, that's enough by honorable mentions. Now, we are going to go on to my number one album of this year. My number one album of this year goes to... drum roll, please. Northlane, Obsidian. Okay, probably not the answer you guys are expecting. I'm going to be honest. But This album is absolutely fantastic in my opinion. It gave me so much nostalgia. I had a huge nostalgia trip when I was listening to this album. I love all of the like EDM influences. There was like tracks like Abomination just hit you like a truck, and like instead of a breakdown, it gets into like this like trance, like whoa 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 whoa. It gets fucking wild. It sounds so cool. And I've never really heard a band have such a like 50-50 split of EDM and metal and just keep going. Like it really just sounds like they keep doing their what's that artist? I'm trying to think of his name right now. That always does the EDM collabs. I literally just reacted to one of the tracks not too long ago. I'm having a tough time thinking of it right now. Maybe I'll think of it in just a second. While I'm doing that, I'll still keep talking. But Northlane Obsidian was absolutely fantastic. I thought it was, at least. One of the things that... Oh, Phase 1. That's what I was thinking of. Sorry, my brain was just going everywhere. I really liked Obsidian. I know it wasn't what people were necessarily expecting, especially hopping off of Alien. But to me, this feels like a pretty solid kind of continuation of their sound. Because they've always had that like electronic style kind of thrown in. But the way that they just really progressed and just put so much stock into these different styles of EDM, it's not just one style. Like, you're getting a lot of this like Matrix sound throughout the album. It just sounds dope. I love it. It makes me feel like I'm hacking, just almost as much as 4D from Alien. I mean, it kind of just feels like 4D made into one long album, if I'm being honest, with that like hacking vibe. Is This a Test is really cool. I know some people didn't care for the repetition as much, because honestly it does repeat quite a bit, but that is a really common staple in a lot of the EDM genres. Is just like you have a sound that repeats and kind of puts you in a trance. You start to just like, oh, we're vibing, we're going. Yeah, kind of doing that. I know it's not something that everybody gravitates towards, especially in the metal community. Not everybody that likes metal is gonna like EDM. That's just a solid fact, and that's okay. But I really felt like this album spoke to me, and one of the tracks I want to talk about on this album that gets me every time. There's actually 2 tracks. That being Nova. That brings me back to, it feels like 90s, like pure just 90s to me. I don't know why. Like, it makes me cry like a little baby when I listen to it, because it just floods me with so much nostalgia when I was younger, listening to like Linkin Park and stuff, because I grew up with Hybrid Theory, one of my favorite albums of all time. And listening to this kind of brought me back to those days when I was just, chilling out as a kid, just doing regular kid things, not worrying about the world. And it really... this album got me through some really tough shit. I'm just going to be honest. This year has not been easy for me at all. It's been a great year. Don't get me wrong. Overall, it's been a really great year for me, but it's also been one of the toughest mentally. There's been a lot of hurdles that I've had to go over, get through, and man, it was a crazy year. But Nova hit me like a truck, and so did Dark Solitaire. Just the ending track. I don't know what it is about that song, but that song also makes me cry like a little baby. It's like the ambience. It just touches my soul. It pulls my heartstrings. But yeah, I mean, Northlane Obsidian, not everybody's cup of tea, but for me, it really just spoke to me the most this year on a personal level. I really hope there's some people out there that agree with this, but if you don't, that's fine. You know what? Music's subjective, and I hope that whatever albums you did enjoy this year, you got as much out of it as possible. You got all that enjoyment. It helped you push through this year like a champ. You finally made it. It's almost 2023 already. You're still alive. You're still kicking. That's something to celebrate. And I'm happy for you guys. I hope everybody's doing well this year. And I can't wait to see you guys in 2023. I really hope to kind of, work on my editing skills, become better as a YouTuber, become better as a person, for that being said. But yeah, what did you guys think about this list? Did you guys have a different list in mind? Were there some albums that maybe you agreed with, disagreed with? Let me know in the comments down below. Wow, I can't speak right now. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and as always, you guys take it easy.